Rain hammered down on the tin roof as the arrogant, rich Heir slammed a crumpled stack of cash into the greasy puddle at my feet and sneered with pure contempt. "You're nothing but a worthless grease monkey who'll never amount to anything." He never once looked at the quiet woman sitting in the corner, gently handing a candy to my daughter. He had no idea. She was the powerful chairwoman who had just seized his entire family empire and was about to hand 51% of it straight to me. That cold, rainy afternoon, I was lying under an old truck in my small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. My hands were covered in grease and oil, and the rain drummed loudly on the tin roof above me. In the far corner, my 7-year-old daughter Millie sat quietly on a plastic chair, coloring a picture of gears and a bright blue sky. She always stayed close when I worked, never complaining about the smell of oil or the noise. I heard the sharp screech of tires outside. A shiny black Porsche came to a sudden stop right in front of the shop, splashing muddy water everywhere. A young man stepped out, Pierce, the arrogant heir to a big real estate investment fund. He wore expensive clothes and carried a silk handkerchief over his nose, as if the smell of my shop disgusted him. He walked straight toward me, his expensive shoes stepping through puddles of oil and rainwater. Without even saying hello, he tossed a thick stack of crumpled cash onto the greasy floor at my feet. "You're just a low-class mechanic," he said with a mocking laugh. "You'll never buy a single wheel of my car in your entire life. Sign the papers and sell this worthless land to me. Take the few dollars and get your daughter out of here before I bring in the bulldozers next week." I slowly slid out from under the truck. I didn't shout. I didn't clench my fists. I simply picked up an old rag and wiped the grease from my hands while glancing over at Millie to make sure she wasn't scared. She kept coloring, but I could see her small shoulders tense up. I looked Pierce straight in the eyes and answered in a calm, steady voice. "This shop is our home. It's not for sale." My heart was beating hard, but I kept my voice even. Every day I worked 14 hours so Millie could have a safe place to grow up. I had learned long ago that losing my temper wouldn't protect her. Only staying strong and quiet would. I had no idea that the woman sitting silently in the corner, wearing an old coat and watching everything, was about to change both our lives forever. That same rainy afternoon, even before Pierce stormed into my shop, I had noticed her. She was sitting quietly in the small waiting area near the corner, wearing an old, worn coat. She had a book in her hands and seemed completely absorbed in it. Her car had broken down earlier, so she had asked if she could wait inside while I took a look. I told her it was no problem at all. Most customers would have been impatient or complained about the smell of oil, but she just sat there peacefully, turning the pages slowly. For the next 2 hours, while I worked under the truck, I could feel her eyes occasionally following me. She watched as I carefully tightened a small bolt that most mechanics would have ignored. She saw me stop what I was doing to move the only small heater closer to Millie so my daughter wouldn't feel cold. And she noticed when an elderly lady came in with a flat tire, and I refused the extra tip she tried to give me, telling her to keep it for her medicine instead. I didn't think much of it then. To me, she was just another customer waiting out the rain. But then Pierce started his tirade, and everything became tense. While I was standing there facing him, Millie quietly slipped off her chair and walked over to the woman with her colorful drawing in hand. My daughter leaned in close and whispered something I could barely hear. "Daddy says loud people are usually the ones who are scared. My daddy is never loud." The woman looked at Millie with gentle eyes, then glanced back at me. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. A quiet understanding, almost like respect. She smiled softly at my daughter and nodded, as if Millie's words had touched her deeply. I went back to dealing with Pierce, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw the woman calmly take out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she typed a short message. She slipped the phone back into her coat pocket without saying a word. I had no idea who she really was. I had no idea that the quiet woman in the worn coat, the one who had been watching me for 2 long hours, was Wren Sterling, the powerful chairwoman who had just taken control of Pierce's entire family empire. And I certainly had no idea that in that very moment, she had already decided to change the future of my small shop and my daughter's life forever. All I knew was that for the first time in a long while, someone was truly seeing me, not as just a grease-covered mechanic, but as a man who was doing his best to protect what mattered most. Pierce was losing patience fast. His face turned red as he realized I wasn't going to sign his papers or back down. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick stack of crumpled cash, and threw it hard onto the oily puddle right at my feet. "Here's money to fix that broken gate of yours," he spat. "Next week I'll bring the bulldozers. Your daughter should start learning how to live on the street because this place is finished." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, but I didn't flinch. I took one slow step forward, positioning my body so Millie was completely behind me. I could feel her small hand clutching the back of my shirt. I knew she was watching. I knew she was scared. But I refused to let her see any violence or rage from her father. I could have ended it in 1 second. My hands were strong from years of heavy work, and Pierce was soft. But I stayed completely still. I kept my voice low and calm. "This shop is our home," I said again, "and my daughter will never have to learn how to live on the street." Pierce laughed bitterly and turned toward the quiet woman still sitting in the corner. He pointed at her with a sneer. "And you, poor lady in the cheap coat, you better start packing too. This whole dump is about to become a junkyard." That was the moment something inside me shifted. I didn't care what he said about me anymore. But hearing him speak to her that way, a stranger who had done nothing wrong, crossed a line. I turned to the woman and spoke gently, my voice soft enough that only she and Millie could hear. "I'm sorry about all this," I said. "Let me take you and Millie inside the back room where it's quieter and safer." I reached out my hand toward Millie and gave the woman a small nod, inviting her to come with us. In that simple act of protecting someone I didn't even know, I felt my own quiet strength rise. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just doing what I always did, shielding the people around me from the ugliness of the world. The woman looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were calm, but there was something deeper in them now, something I couldn't quite understand. She closed her book slowly and stood up without saying a word. I had no idea that my decision to protect her in that moment, a complete stranger wearing an old coat, was the final trigger that would change everything. Pierce kept laughing behind me, thinking he had won. He thought I was weak. He thought we were all beneath him. He had no idea how wrong he was. I had just turned to lead the woman and Millie toward the back room when she stopped walking. She gently closed her book, folded it under her arm, and removed the old scarf from around her neck. In that single motion, everything about her changed. The quiet, unassuming woman in the worn coat was gone. What stood in her place was someone who carried an invisible weight of absolute authority. She walked past me with calm, measured steps and stopped directly in front of Pierce. He was still laughing, still convinced he had won. But the moment she spoke, the laughter died in his throat. "You were right about one thing," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, without any heat or anger. "This place is about to change." Pierce frowned, confused. "What did you just say?" She took out her phone, tapped the screen once, and held it up so the speaker was clearly audible. A conference call was already live. The voices of several board members could be heard in the background. "My name is Ren Sterling," she continued in that same steady tone. 10 minutes ago, Sterling Global completed the full acquisition of your family's entire investment fund." Pierce's face went pale. His expensive shoes took one shaky step backward. The color drained from his cheeks as the reality hit him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Your accounts have been frozen. Your position is terminated. You have 5 minutes to remove your car from this property before I contact the authorities for trespassing." Pierce stood frozen, mouth opening and closing without sound. The stack of cash he had thrown at my feet now looked ridiculous on the dirty floor. He tried to speak, but nothing came out except a broken stammer. Finally, he turned and stumbled out of the shop, leaving the door swinging behind him. The sound of his Porsche roaring away faded quickly into the rain. The workshop fell completely silent except for the rain on the tin roof. Ren Sterling turned slowly toward me. The cold, commanding presence in her eyes softened into something warm and genuine. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. She placed it carefully on my workbench, right next to the tools still covered in grease. "Vance," she said quietly, "I have spent years watching powerful men destroy everything they touch. I no longer trust people who wear expensive suits and loud voices. I trust the ones who protect others in silence." She looked me straight in the eyes. "I am giving you 51% ownership of the entire redevelopment project on this land. I want you to run it. Not as a mechanic taking orders, but as the man who decides how this place grows. You protected your daughter. You protected a stranger you thought was powerless. That is the kind of leadership this company has been missing." I stared at the document in my oil-stained hands. My mind could not fully process what she had just said. The man who had been called worthless only minutes ago was now being handed control over land worth millions. Millie peeked out from behind me, still holding her drawing. Ren smiled at her, then looked back at me. "You don't have to decide today," she said softly. "But I hope you will consider it. Because the quiet ones, they are the ones who actually build things that last." I stood there, heart pounding, grease still on my hands, unable to find words. Everything I had believed about power, about who mattered and who did not, had just been turned upside down in the most silent way possible. 1 week later, the rain had finally stopped, and the afternoon sun filtered softly through the open garage doors. I stood by my workbench, wiping the last traces of grease from my hands with a clean cloth. Across the shop, Ren Sterling sat on an old tire I had cleaned especially for her. She was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, nothing like the powerful chairwoman who had stood in this same space 7 days earlier. Millie was kneeling beside her, happily teaching her how to color a big gear drawing with bright crayons. "See, Miss Wren? You have to press gently, like this," Millie said with complete seriousness, guiding Wren's hand. "If you push too hard, the color goes outside the lines." Wren smiled, a real warm smile I had never seen on her face before. She followed Millie's instructions carefully, her fingers now smudged with blue and yellow crayon. For the first time, she looked completely at ease, as if sitting on an old tire in a small auto shop was the most natural place in the world. I watched them quietly from a few steps away. There were no lawyers, no contracts being signed, no talk of millions or corporate takeovers. Just the three of us sharing an ordinary Saturday afternoon. The woman who controlled billions sat laughing softly as my 7-year-old daughter explained why gears needed happy colors. And I, the mechanic who had been called worthless, stood there feeling something I had not felt in years, complete peace. Ren looked up and caught my eye. She gave me a small nod, the kind that needed no words. In that moment, all the invisible walls that once separated us, money, status, power, had quietly disappeared. What remained was simple and real. A father protecting his daughter, a woman who had chosen to see the good in people, and a little girl who reminded us both that kindness was never a weakness. I folded the clean cloth in my hands and smiled. This was not the ending I had expected when Pierce threw that money at my feet. But it was the ending I had always hoped for, one where my daughter could grow up knowing that quiet strength, honest work, and a simple sandwich shared with a stranger could change everything.
You know, my friend, this story is an original piece of fiction crafted from the heart for you. Though the characters are imagined, the feelings are very real. The exhaustion of a father working long hours to protect his child, the pain of being looked down upon, and the quiet power of choosing kindness, even when the world tries to break you. This tale carries one simple truth. Never mistake loud arrogance for real strength. True power is silent. It lives in the grease-stained hands of a man who refuses to bow. It lives in the heart of a father who protects his daughter without raising his voice. And it lives in the choice of someone at the very top who decides to lift up those the world calls small. Your clothes, your title, your money, none of them define who you are. What defines you is how you treat the people who can give you nothing in return. Thank you for listening to my story today. If it touched something inside you, please let me know in the comments. I'll keep sharing these healing stories every week, because here we believe quiet kindness always wins in the end.